In the southwestern corner of A Link to the Past's bleak and unforgiving dark world lies what is canonically known as the Swamp of Evil. A desolate, somber, drizzly marshland plagued by an endless, supernatural downpour. A stark contrast to its counterpart in the light world, the sunny and bone-dry desert of mystery. Now, some of you watching may remember this location under a different name, the Misery Mire, which is actually the name of the dungeon you access from here and not the swamp itself. It's very similar to Skull Woods, which for many people can refer to both the dungeon and the forest it's located in, even though it's technically called the Skeleton Forest. To avoid confusion, I will also refer to the area as a whole as the Misery Mire, mainly because it's more convenient for today's story, but it's also worth mentioning that in the Japanese edition of A Link to the Past, the swamp and dungeon therein do actually share the same name, Akuma Nonuma, or Devil Swamp, which would be an awesome name for a band, by the way. Actually, it is the name of a band. What the hell? Anyway, while the dungeon itself is pretty solid, the exterior of the Misery Mire is actually quite forgettable. In fact, most players won't spend more than a few minutes here. However, somewhere around the early 2000s, it would suddenly draw some unexpected attention. It seemed that the swamp is home to some kind of unseen presence, something invisible to the naked eye, yet whose presence can be seen, heard, and felt under the right conditions. In the bottom right corner of the map, close to the ridge where you first enter the swamp from the light world, you will find a lily pad with a small tree right below it, and it's in this general space where the phenomena is best observed. Now, the easiest way to do it is to use one of the medallions. In this case, I'm using bombos, but any of them will do. If you activate the medallion and then wait for the animation to play out, something or someone can be seen bursting into flames, accompanied by the sound effect of an enemy dying. After that, a bomb drop will appear, which will happen every single time. Quite unusual. Now, judging from its behavior, the flames, the death sound effect, and the bomb drop, we can assume that whatever is present here has to be some kind of enemy. But why is it invisible? Why is Link seemingly unaffected by it? And why does it show up in a different location every time it dies? Does it actually move, or is the attack causing some kind of weird knockback? These are the questions that user Tempest of Shadows, also known as Thol, asked himself a long time ago. Thol is credited for the discovery of the anomaly and is also the first person to document it in great detail. In fact, you can still find his full documentation in the GameFAQs archive, which he kept up to date for several years as new information came to light. Now, the archive doesn't list the date of creation, so it's hard to pinpoint when exactly the document was first uploaded, but we do know that it's not the original. The oldest draft you can still find online is from March 2003, and can be viewed on Thol's now defunct website through the Wayback Machine, though even this one is labeled as version 1.6, so it likely goes back even further than that. It outlines the entire history, including the backstory behind the discovery, a tutorial on how to find it for yourself, some initial theories people came up with, as well as the results of various experiments conducted by Thol himself and others who joined the search later on. If you want to experience a little blast from the past, I can definitely recommend giving it a read, as it goes into a lot more detail than I can cover here. In the meantime, I will present more or less the Cliff Notes version. So while the documentation started in the early 2000s, the actual discovery dates back much further. According to Thol, he stumbled upon the anomaly by accident between the end of 1992 and early 1993, only about 6 months after the game came out in North America. Upon his discovery, Thol, a man after my own heart, wasn't just gonna let it slide, and decided to send a letter detailing his findings to Nintendo of America, more specifically the Nintendo Game Counselors, which was an official hotline that ran from 1987 all the way up to 2005. One of the counselors, a man by the name of Eric Was, ended up replying, and he confirmed that he was able to replicate Thol's discovery, but that he had no idea what it was or what caused it. What followed was a series of experiments and theories regarding the enemy's behavior, its characteristics, and of course, its possible identity. A search which involved at least 5 different people from what I can tell. It's also around this time that the entity would receive the name it's currently known by, the Ghost of Misery Mire. It wouldn't be long, however, that people realized the entity wasn't alone. Shortly into the investigation, someone named Nick Harvey discovered a second ghost near a tree stump to the north, just a couple of tiles over from the original entity. Then a third was spotted not too far from that one. 3 mysterious entities who were all exerting the same unexplained behavior. Which brings us to the many unusual characteristics of the ghosts. Because it's not just that the enemy is invisible, there's a whole laundry list of weird stuff that happens when you interact with these guys in various ways. I won't go into every single detail, but just to give you an idea, here are some of the most notable findings. Number 1, in its neutral state, the ghost is completely impervious to the sword and hammer. You can try until your thumb wears out, hits simply won't register. Number 2, the enemy can be harmed or killed with many other weapons. Not just the medallions, but arrows, the boomerang, bombs, the fire and ice rod, the cane of Samaria, and the cane of Burna. All of them can inflict damage and eventually kill the ghost with enough hits. Number 3, just like most regular enemies, the ghost can be stunned using the hookshot. You still won't be able to see it, but repeat hits indicate that the enemy is indeed frozen in position. It also causes a weird audio glitch to occur, where Link's footsteps are temporarily overlaid with the sound of the hookshot extending. This effect will last for as long as the enemy remains stunned, after which the audio goes back to normal. Number 4, while the enemy is stunned, it is no longer immune to the sword and hammer all of a sudden. If you can find out its position after stunning it, you can kill it. Number 5, under no circumstance will the ghost inflict damage on Link, nor does it apply any physical force like knockback or even just blocking his path. Their physical hitboxes completely ignore each other. Number 6, the ghost seems to stick to a certain perimeter. It is always there in the same general spot, no matter what you do or how much time passes. Number 7, bees.
No, not the bees! Not the bees!
Bees do not seem to detect the ghost whatsoever like they do many other enemies. So whatever the ghost is, it hasn't been flagged as a target for them. And finally, number 8, the ghosts are present in every official build of A Link to the Past. Not just the regular ports, but even the revamped version on the Game Boy Advance, which makes you wonder if the developers are even aware of it, or perhaps left it in on purpose, who knows. Speaking of which, some of the early theories proposed that the ghosts could be an unused enemy the developers forgot to remove from the final build. Eric from Nintendo speculated that it might be a light world enemy that is somehow bleeding over into the dark world, like one of the sand creatures found in the Desert of Mystery, which are apparently called Geldmen. See, many overworld enemies have a dark world counterpart, which have more or less the same AI, they just do more damage. But there are a few exceptions, and the Geldman is one of them. So basically the idea was that perhaps these creatures were supposed to have a dark world counterpart, but it was never completed. And so all that remains is an empty sprite with its graphics and many of its hitboxes unfinished. Others propose that it could simply be an existing enemy who's glitched out for some reason. One example given in Thol's document are the Swamolas, those snakes who dive in and out of the water. Some even thought it might be some kind of armored enemy due to its immunity to the sword. Safe to say, there was no shortage of ideas, and while some of them came pretty close to the truth, ultimately no one got it completely right. The true answer to the mystery would arrive in the mid-2000s with the release of Hyrule Magic, the first editing tool specifically for A Link to the Past, which allows you to modify the game file without the need of actual coding. With it, you can view the various screens and subscreens present in the game and make limited changes to the landscape, the enemy and item placement, entrances, events, and so on. And it's here inside the level editor that the identity of the ghost was finally revealed. If you go to Area 70, which is the Misery Mire, you will notice that there are indeed enemy spawns in the exact locations the ghosts are known to show up. And turns out it was actually a Fireball Zora all along. Now technically the enemy's name is Ku, which are the Dark World counterparts to the Zora you encounter in Hyrule. But like most enemies who have a dark and light variant, both are stored under the same name and ID number in the game's memory. In fact, as far as the system is concerned, they are the same enemy. They share the same AI, they run on the same block of code. The only difference is that it swaps out the sprites and tweaks a few variables like the HP and damage output. That's it. So for the sake of convenience and because I refuse to say the word Ku over and over, I will refer to both variants as simply Zora. Not to be confused with the walking Zora inside Zora's River. Those are classified as a different enemy type altogether and don't even have a Dark World counterpart. So knowing what we know now, it's easy to see what the issue is with the enemies inside the Misery Mire. Zoras are programmed to emerge from deep water only. However, the ghosts have been placed in shallow water instead, meaning they can't surface anywhere, and as a result, they glitch out. You can actually test this by taking a light world Zora and then repositioning it on dry land, for example. It will behave the exact same way as its ghostly brethren in the dark world. Which made me wonder, what about other enemy types? Will they produce similar results when misplaced? Well, I did a lot of testing, and while I wasn't able to cover every single enemy, I can say for now that the answer is no. Not a single enemy would mimic the ghost behavior, not even the walking Zora. They may go out of bounds or walk on water like Jesus Christ, or the graphics get all jumbled up because of memory limitations, but aside from that, the enemies still function. They don't become invisible, their hitboxes still work as intended, no audio issues or any of the other weird stuff we see happen with the ghosts. So it really seems that the glitch is unique to this enemy alone. In other words, not only did the level designer misplace an enemy, they did it to the one enemy that will glitch out like this and cause all sorts of anomalies. Anomalies which would eventually be picked up on by an unsuspecting kid in the 90s, and in turn led to an entire ghost hunt involving several people, including a Nintendo employee. I mean, talk about a butterfly effect. Now, this is where any sane person would wrap it up and say, end of story. I mean, we know what the ghost is, we have known for quite a while now, so mystery solved, right? In fact, it was solved almost 2 decades ago. But that's not how we roll here on the Monster Maze channel. I don't want to just regurgitate someone else's story, I want to expand upon it, you know? See if I can bring anything new to the table. And when you step back and look at it, there's still a lot of stuff that remains unanswered. In fact, the conclusion we have right now is that it's a glitched out fireball Zora, and that's about it. Which only explains what it is, not why it acts the way it does. Like why the enemy is immune to some attacks but not others, or what the deal is with the weird movement. Heck, if it is indeed a Zora who's basically stuck underwater indefinitely, why would anything be able to hit this thing in the first place? After all, the Zora who function normally are completely impervious to any and all attacks while submerged, even to the medallions. In other words, I need details. So I decided to take a peek under the hood of A Link to the Past, into the very core of what makes the game tick, and see if I can find out exactly what is going on with these enemies. And what I found was quite shocking, to say the least. I realized that I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. Yeah, safe to say I have next to no experience with assembly code, or ROM hacking in general for that matter. I mean, I do have a history in programming, but like, this is old school stuff right here, and only one step removed from actual binary. Figuring this stuff out on my own would take me ages, so I did the next logical thing, you know, besides giving up and going outside, and got help from someone who actually does know what they're doing. Which is where Cat Devs Games came in, one of the developers and co-creators of the Link to the Past randomizer. She was kind enough to guide me through the more difficult parts and help me to understand some of the game's inner workings. So just so we're clear, most of what I'm about to cover is all thanks to her input. To start things off, I wanted to see if I can get an actual visual on the ghost, as that alone could provide some pretty useful information. In the footage you see here, there's a custom script running in the background which shows the hitbox of every object on screen. It also provides all sorts of information for each individual sprite, which will prove to be very handy later on. So let's take our newfound power and pay a visit to this so-called ghost, shall we? Well, there it is, and it's moving alright, like Sonic on Red Bull. If we go into frame by frame mode, you'll see that it changes position every single frame, but always within a set radius of its original spawn point, which I marked with a skull. You'll also notice that when I damage or kill the enemy, it receives no knockback of any kind. However, when I stun it, it does receive knockback, and the trajectory it takes lines up with the direction it was hit from. After that, it behaves just like any other enemy. It stays frozen in place for a while, starts shaking, and then it's back to business. Now there's a lot of stuff happening in the game's code all at the same time, so let's break it down into separate parts, starting with the invisibility and the erratic movement. So the way it works is that there's a list of predetermined conditions, also known as states, which can be applied universally to different enemies and objects. Things like a neutral state, stunned or frozen, dying, falling into a pit, so on and so forth. Now on top of these global states, enemies also have a set of AI states, which are unique to each enemy type and is indicated by this number right here. These AI states will dictate what the enemy does, like moving, looking around, spawning a projectile, burrowing underground, all that stuff. The Fireball Zora has 4 AI states. Choose surfacing location, surfacing, attack, and submerging. The way it cycles through its AI states will differ per enemy type. It can be random, sequential, or somewhere in between. But in the Zora's case, the stages are sequential, meaning it always moves from 0 to 1, 2, 3, and then back to 0 again to start a new cycle. The only exception is when the enemy unloads or if the cycle is interrupted by an attack, for example, in which case it may reset to 0 regardless of where it was in the cycle. Choose surfacing location, as the name suggests, is where the Zora attempts to find a suitable spot to surface from, which, as we all know, has to be deep water. It does this by generating a random set of coordinates within a set perimeter of its spawn point, with 8 pixels as the multiplier and 32 pixels as the cap. It then moves the sprite to this new location, and whatever tile it lands on, it will perform a check. If it's a deep water tile, the AI moves on to the next state, and the Zora starts surfacing. If it's not deep water, it'll remain in state 0 and repeat the same process. It calculates a new position, moves over to it, and again checks for deep water. It will continue to do this on every single frame until it finds a tile that meets the criteria. Now, even if the spawn point itself is located outside the water, the Zora can still find a place to surface from. It may take a couple of tries, but as long as there's a deep water tile somewhere within that search grid, the enemy will function normally. And that's where the problem lies. The ghosts have been positioned too far away, such that there are no deep water tiles close enough to surface from, and so it just sits there, endlessly performing the same calculation over and over, its AI state stuck at 0 for all eternity. Now, for the sake of demonstration, I wrote a few lines of code of my own that brute forces the AI to always be in the attack state. And as you can see, the ghosts are now fully visible. Deep water be damned. So yes, technically speaking, the ghost Zoras are stuck underwater indefinitely. Which brings us to the next part. If it's supposed to be perpetually submerged, why is it not immune to attacks like the regular Zora? And why do some weapons work but not others? Well, some of you may have already made the connection that all the items that do have an effect are either projectile-based or AoE attacks, like bombs and the medallions. Turns out these types of attacks operate independently from melee attacks, and also include stuff like throwable items like pots and bushes. And yes, even the sword beam falls under this category, which can indeed kill the ghost as well. In fact, if I had to make an educated guess, I would say that this is probably how the ghost was first discovered. Thol mentions that he doesn't remember exactly how it happened, just that he found it while mindlessly slashing the sword around, which, as we've demonstrated by now, is impossible, unless he somehow stunned it first. But if he had full hearts, he would have had access to the sword beam, which he may have hit one of the ghosts with by accident. So anyway, to oversimplify, there's a part of the code that handles melee attacks and a completely separate part that deals with projectiles and AoE, which is a bit unconventional compared to how modern games handle it. Now, the reason the sword and hammer don't work is actually pretty simple. Technically, the weapon hitbox and the ghost hitbox are interacting with each other. However, the function that checks how much damage should be dealt to either the Zora itself or to the player is only active during AI state 2, which makes sense since this is when the Zora is above the waterline. Only then should it be able to hit you and vice versa. But because the ghosts are forever stuck in the 0 state, the damage check is never executed and nothing happens. One exception, however, is when one of those global states I mentioned are in effect. This may seem a bit weird and confusing, but it actually makes sense when you think about it. When an enemy gets stunned, for example, all of its AI behavior is essentially frozen. No code is being executed, and so when Link hits it, it won't be able to check for damage either. In this situation, the global state, which has its own logic, takes over and performs a damage check on behalf of the enemy. Hence why you can hit the ghost with the sword after you stun it with the hookshot. Oh, and before I forget, the bees? Yeah, turns out that's not actually a glitch. Bees simply don't attack Zora for some reason, even when they function as intended. In fact, they seem to be among the few enemy types that aren't flagged as a target for them. Maybe because bees really hate water or something, I don't fucking know. I'm not a biologist. So what about all the other weapons? Why can they hit the ghost regardless if it's stunned or not? I gotta say, this was definitely the most difficult part for me to grasp, and Kat had to do some pretty heavy lifting here. Not because it's super complicated, but if you don't know what you're looking for, you're kinda screwed. So to understand what's happening, we have to shift our attention to the info dump on the left again, and the two variables to look out for are timer and ankilla. Now in the context of the Zora, the timer dictates how long the enemy will remain in any given state, before it moves on to the next one. It is set to a predetermined number on the first frame of the state, then counts down as the action is performed and will hit 0 on the last frame. Then it resets to a new number on the very next frame, which is when the next action starts. As far as the cycle goes, it takes the Zora 120 frames to surface, another 120 to complete its attack, and then 23 frames to submerge. Then the AI resets to 0. However, before it starts calculating a new position, it waits for an additional 128 frames, which of course is to prevent the Zora from submerging and then resurfacing again instantly. After this little pause, as the timer reaches 0, it picks a new position. The timer resets again, and the cycle continues. Now, you'll notice that at certain points, the Ankilla value will temporarily sync up with the timer, which happens twice. Once when the Zora is surfacing, and again during that brief pause at the beginning of state 0. So what is the Ankilla variable and what does it do? Well, it determines whether or not an enemy can be hit with projectiles and AoE attacks. If the value is 0, it's vulnerable. If it's any other value, it's immune. Now in the case of most enemy types, they simply flip the value to either 1 or 0. With the Geldman, for example, it's set to 0 when it's above ground and 1 when it's burrowed. But for the Zora, they decided to handle it a bit differently. When it's in an AI state where it isn't supposed to get hit, they will simply dump the value of the timer into the Ankilla variable, which means that for the entire duration of that state, the value is not 0, thus it's impervious to attacks. Alternatively, when you are supposed to be able to hit it, like during the attack state, the Ankilla value no longer syncs up with the timer and is forced to stay at 0, meaning it's now vulnerable. It's actually a pretty clever solution. The only problem, however, is that after that 128 frame pause, when it's busy calculating its new position, the timer remains frozen at 0 and doesn't reset and start running until it finds a suitable spot to surface from, which of course in the case of the Ghost never happens. And so the timer remains stuck at 0, and with it the Ankilla variable as well. Funnily enough, because of the way this whole timer mechanic works, it's actually possible to cheese regular Zora as well, because even they will sometimes land on a tile that's not deep water, in which case it also recalculates and tries again. It may even land on the wrong spot a couple of frames in a row. So with a bit of luck and good timing, you can actually catch it during those few frames and kill them when you're not supposed to. They never knew what hit him. And that covers pretty much all I wanted to know. The only thing I couldn't figure out was the audio glitch, though I did find out that it happens to normal Zora as well, so hell if I know. I want to give a massive thanks to Cat Devs Games for her incredible input and, having the patience to sit through all my questions. Safe to say that without her help, a big part of the video wouldn't have been possible. I also want to give a shout out to Shadow1333, who made a custom patch for the game that removes all the HUD elements. A link to the past footage has always been a bit of a pain to work with, given the aspect ratio and the massive HUD that takes up almost a third of the screen. So his patch combined with Mode 7 widescreen has been an absolute blessing. As always, a big thanks to my generous supporters on Patreon and here on YouTube, my mods, my Discord community, and of course you for watching. That is all for now, and I hope to see you all next time.